In this video, I'm going to talk to you about approaches used to estimate the amount of carbon stored within a load of pine logs, a truckload of pine logs. To begin with, then, the pine forest industry is big business in the southeastern U.S. And of course, many people may wonder, what is the carbon footprint of each truckload of pine logs? And how much is that offsetting, say, all the factors that are going into the pine forest industry, the manufacturing of those vehicles. Of course, you've got to divvy up that manufacturing, all the carbon footprint of that among all the log loads for that particular combination of truck and trailer, the cab and the trailer. But then also the fellow buncher and so forth, the harvesting, the mill operations. All of that is what's the carbon footprint of this particular truckload in relation to all that. So some people may just find it very interesting how much carbon is stored in these logs on a log or truckload. And then others, you can use it once again to look at, say, regional or national assessments of carbon footprints from logs and the forest industry, so forth. So all this kind of can contribute to these carbon footprint analyses. So some things to consider is the legal gross vehicle weight that's allowed in each state. And on federal interstates, it's been a long-standing, and it's an issue often, that the maximum gross vehicle weight, both of the cab, the truck, and the trailer, plus the payload, is 80,000 pounds. So then you have the unladen tear weight. That's when the truck is unloaded or there's no logs on the truck. So here's your weight of the cab and the trailer. And then, of course, the difference is the payload. So here we're just going to make the simplifying assumption that every truckload is legal and that it reaches the maximum GVW allowed for that state given harvest permits on the particular road, whether interstate or federal or state funded highways, and then given the tier weight. And so we'll just take the difference between the maximum GVW and the assumed tier weight of the cab and the trailer. And of course, some other things is, how long have those logs been sitting there? What is the moisture content of those logs? Because remember, the maximum GVW, right? If the moisture content's low, well, you might be able to put more logs on that truck, so that you can have more carbon on the truck. But then you also have other restrictions, such as the height. You can only have 13 feet 6 inches, I believe, in all the southeastern states. So you can't pile up a load of logs 40 feet up. But nonetheless, right? What is the moisture content? That's kind of difficult. The minute I'm sure the log is severed from the stump, and I'm sure it's losing a little bit of moisture content, but how long does it sit? So let me talk about 4 bolster trailers, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then your pole trailer. And you can see there's less structure to the pole trailer, so they're generally going to weigh less than the 4 bolsters. These are the 2 common types of trailers you'll see in the southern states, southeastern U.S. And we're going to assume a 4 bolster, 10,000 pounds, the unladen tier weight when it's empty. Then you have your day cabs and your sleeper cabs, and these can vary. It also varies by the manufacturer. There's a variety of sleeper options that can impact, once again, that unladen tear weight. Given the legal maximum gross vehicle weight, what's the payload? The sleeper cab is going to reduce that payload often. I mean, once again, it can depend a little bit on the manufacturer and all the other options, like the stacks and so forth, all the other options that you have. But here we're going to assume a day cab, and that day cab is going to weigh 19,000 pounds. So then total, right, that's 29,000 pounds of tier weight. 10,000 pounds for the 4 bolster trailer, 19,000 pounds for the day cab, so that's 29,000 pounds. And we can assume, for example, in Mississippi, that given a harvest permit, the maximum GVW, gross vehicle weight, is 88,000 pounds. And once again, we're just going to make the simplifying assumption that there's no other weight that's contributing. So therefore, then we're just going to take the 88,000 pounds minus the 29,000 pounds tier weight, and then we're going to get 59,000 pounds of payload, or 29.5 tons. So here are the legal gross vehicle weights by state. And once again, these are the federal funded and state funded highways. And then here's your interstates. Now, Louisiana and Mississippi, they've been able to have some exemptions to that federal law on the interstates. So Louisiana is king here, and of course we're king on the interstates, Mississippi is. But then, right, we got the truck tier weight, the 19,000 pounds, the tier unladen trailer weight, 10,000, 29,000. We take that from the maximum GVW, and here's the payload in logs that we have that would be legal given harvest permits and all the legal documentation, I guess, or that these log truck drivers would need. So there's a few other concerns. Like I said, there's legal restrictions on height. I believe all the southeastern states have 13 feet 6 inches. This relates back a lot to like bridges and so forth, to particularly on the interstates, but also bridges code and so forth that you have around the state. So once again, right, if the bug killed wood, or the wood's been sitting for a while and the moisture content's down, you can't just stack it up 40 feet tall. So then you're going to probably have less weight than the maximum GVW. Once again, we're just going to assume everything is to the max GVW and everything is legal. Another thing that could contribute maybe to the amount of carbon is the log overhang. So for instance, like in Mississippi, logs can be up to 28 feet from the rear axle and still be legal. And I would think, once again, right, that's going to create some issues, say like with the bark wood ratio, pulpwood and so forth, to where that could impact a little bit the amount of carbon, depending on if you're having more like saw logs or more pulpwood hanging way off there. But all of that, I think, is going to come into play a little bit. Double bunk, single bunk, overlay stacked, if you've seen these, particularly like with the plantation trailers, that could play a factor. We're just going to make the simplifying assumption of a single bunk. And so here's the simplest estimate, right? We have our maximum GVW, we have our tier weights, our unladen tier weights, and then we have our payloads. And so we're just going to make the assumption that this is green weight. Once again, that could be a little bit, it's not going to be dry weight per se, but right, because usually they're going to sever the tree and get it skidded and then load it onto the trucks pretty quickly and heading off to the mills. But you could lose a little bit of weight. But once again, that height restriction is going to kind of limit that. So let's just assume it's green weight, and then we're going to assume that dry weight is 50% of the green weight, and then that 50% of the dry weight is carbon, that basic assumption that we always make. So here's our carbon in tons, 2,000 pounds, and here's our carbon in metric tons, 2205, 2204.6. And then we can get our metric ton CO2 equivalent based on, right, you've probably seen this conversion factor of 3.667, the atomic weight of CO2, 16 plus 16, the 2 oxygen plus 12 carbon, and you're in carbon, so then you multiply the carbon, metric tons, by 3.667 to get your metric ton CO2 equivalent. So that's the simplest, right? But then, of course, we all know there's going to be a lot of factors. Some that are going to impact it more seriously than others. Most definitely, I think we would all agree, species is going to play a part. Genotype of those species, physiographic region, regional variation, perhaps even soil type could all impact the percent carbon. The bark wood ratio, why? Because that's going to impact the weight for that volume. Could impact a little bit with the height restrictions, the log overhang restrictions, but also the percent carbon that is within the bark and the wood. So anything that's going to alter that relationship is going to probably have an impact on the amount of carbon on that truck, plus the moisture content. So we often think that could vary by genotype, thinned versus unthinned, but also position on the tree. The butt log's often going to have less moisture content, more heartwood and so forth, for the same amount of volume, say, as an upper stem log. So if you're coming from the upper stem log or the butt log. Why is that important? Because remember that maximum gross vehicle weight. You can only have so many logs on that truck. So if you got if the moisture content's less, you should be able to get more logs on there given the GVW and then the height restrictions. And a wide range of butt diameter. So example, like with saw logs, 11 inches, let's say 11 inches up to 25 inches on the butt is what a mill can take. Well, if it's a naturally generated stand, you may have quite a bit of variability in there, and all that variability may impact, once again, the bark-wood ratio, the moisture content. So all of that could play a factor into the weight that may be a little bit different in terms of the carbon if you had more of a uniform plantation. Time since the harvest of trees were being hot, I've already mentioned that. Season time of the year, the winter, the summer. Winter we would expect to have higher moisture content than the summer. Once again, that could impact the number of logs on the truck and the gross vehicle weight restrictions and so forth, and then bug killed wood related to this as well, time since the harvest of trees. And once again, that height restriction could come into play. But all of this is going to create a little bit of variability. So traditionally then, we've assumed that 50% of dry weight is carbon. Well, the FIA, the USDA, FI Forest Service, Forest Inventory and Analysis, has started using some differing values. And this is my interpretation of what they use. So you got your 4 species. Once again, I said, right, species, but also moisture content species, taper rates, wood bark ratios with the species as well. And we can still make the simplifying assumption that 50% of the bark dry weight, and that's probably, once again, all of this is simplified, but this will give us some idea of a little more refined than just the simplest approach that I told you. So now we need to get kind of a ratio of the wood to bark on a particular truckload. So in order to do that, I took a Excel-based simulator that I've been working with a lot and creating, entitled Gulf Lob. It uses an older growth and yield model system from Baldwin and Fiducia. I feel that's representative of non-industrial private forest landowners, family forest owners today. You can increase the site index. And Baldwin then, around that time, which is very nice, around 1987, had a system of equations that estimates the total oven dry and green weight, and then the ratio to merchantable. Because a lot of times we're not hauling the whole stem, we're hauling a merchantable stem. So if you're talking about just like the saw logs, up to like an 8-inch or 6-inch or 4-inch or 2-inch top on pulpwood, well, then we really need to get the amount of content in the merchantable log. That's where these ratio equations can come in. Why do we need the green weight? Once again, because we need to determine the amount of logs on that truck, given the maximum gross vehicle weight and the tier weights of the truck and trailer. And then once we get the number of logs, then we can estimate the dry weight, the wood bark ratio, and then the carbon. So here, this plantation was planted at 605 seedlings per acre. Not that I recommend that planting density, particularly given the conditions in the Western Gulf. I recommend more around 450 seedlings per acre today, but that's what has been used in the past. Site index 65, so we bump up that older growth and yield system up a little bit, base age 25, and we're just going to look at a 30-year-old plant, a clear cut at 30 years old for an unthinned stand with these conditions, and then a once thinned stand at age 21 on a third row thinning. And once again, that's becoming much more common in much of the Western Gulf, and particularly in Mississippi. Then we have our percent carbon contents from here for the loblolly, and then once again we assume that simplifying assumption for the bark, and then we need that green weight to get the number of logs on the truck. So here's the results. The age 30 clear cut, here's your unthinned diameter distribution, your thinned. We're going to look at the saw logs and then the pulpwood. So the gray is the saw logs, 11 inches DBH and up, and then the pulpwood down here on the thinned, just on the thinned. So here's, once again, here's by state the payload, the tons. Here's our basic assumptions where we assumed this was all green weight and that 50% of that was dry weight, 50% was carbon. We got our equivalents. And now we're going to make a little more refined. So we're coming off that growth unit model system, looking much more at the diameter distribution and so forth. And you can see that it does impact the amount of carbon that we're estimating in these stands. The unthinned is going to be a little bit different than the thinned. That could be a wood bark ratio, tape error. Maybe there's some different allocation of the physiological inside of the moisture content. And then pulpwood, you can see that the pulpwood is less than the saw logs. To me, why is that? That pulpwood could have a higher bark wood ratio, right? That bark probably going to have a higher moisture content, which I would think would make the pulpwood a little bit heavier. So I'm assuming that within the equation system from Baldwin, that the smaller trees have more moisture content in them. And of course, given the legal gross vehicle weight restrictions, that's then going to reduce essentially the number of logs that you have on there for that pulpwood size logs. And that's why, to me, once again, that's why it kind of differs a little bit from the saw logs for that thin stand at age 30. And I just wanted to show, here's your day cab at 19,000 pounds. Here's a sleeper cab at 25,000 pounds. So notice the payload is less. That's an additional 6,000 pound reduction in the payload. And you can see how that impacts all your estimates going through for the sleeper cab as compared to the day cab. And that's just another factor, that tier weight, that unladen tier weight that's going to come into play for a particular truckload, the amount of carbon being stored in a particular truckload of pine logs. Thank you.